welcome to this edition of Fuel for Thought. I'm Kristen Balasia, Head of Automotive Advisory at IHS Markit. Today, I'm joined by my colleagues, Mark Boyadjis and Colin Martinez. All of us having hoped to be in person at what turned out to be a pretty exciting automotive CES this year. Still, we're able to attend and enjoy a lot of the exciting announcements and interaction that went on. So today we're going to be talking about CES. And this year, Mark, I'll start with you. It felt a little bit different, and not just because so much of it was virtual, but I would say different in a good way, an exciting way, really. How would you describe it, having been there a number of years now?
Thanks, Kristen, and thanks for having me on. Yeah, this year was certainly interesting. It seemed like a lot of the companies who had throughout the course of the summer and into the fall were planning. Plan A was to be there, be in person, have some pretty significant announcements to make. And, somewhere in the middle of December's, one by one, they started kind of dropping off, and for a lot of good reasons that happened. So the thing is they had a lot of content ready. They had a lot of announcements ready to go. And I'm talking about OEMs and suppliers. And I think 2021 was a year that companies started working out of their COVID holes to some extent, and getting back to the business of planning and innovating and executing on these kind of strategic directions. And CES this year, I think, was an exhibition highlighting how some of these companies are going to execute. We saw some significant detail from General Motors and what they're going to be doing in electrification, both in terms of products like the Silverado EV that are going to be on the market here soon. We saw some discussion about their future product as well, and how they're moving into further stages of electrification and software. We saw the evolution of BrightDrop. We saw Stellantis talking about all of their platforms and technologies that they're going to start to bring to market, and other examples in and around that. So it was very much a year focused on trying to bring the story back to, this is what's happening. Here's how we're changing the game. And I think a lot of the vendors, both suppliers and OEMs alike, had that teed up for CES 2022.
Absolutely. And what was interesting too was they certainly talked about product, as you mentioned a few of those, but there was also a shift of focus from not just products to really a customer experience and a custom customer experience. And I know we'll talk a little bit more about this in detail, but whether it was services or software, or whether it was color, interior or exterior, by the way, BMW with some pretty cool things there, sounds, smells, and the ability to change these things was, I think, really a shift in focus also, and got consumers excited about it, and really showed you things that you could, touch, feel, smell, hear, and talked about that experience that differentiated their product or their brand. And Colin, I know you also attended a lot of these virtual presentations. What stood out to you?
Yeah, that's a good point too about personalization. I mean, one of the big things that stood out to me was so many announcements. Having gone to CES for so long, there was so much talk about over-the-air updates and software platforms and how that could create this personalization in the car. And just seeing that sort of come to fruition, you saw what General Motors, among a myriad of announcements, this all-encompassing branding name, Ultifi. It's a software platform for their cloud system, their over-the-air update system, and cybersecurity system. And they even mentioned, possibly a couple of use cases for that OTA system, which would be downloading new driver preferences or new calibrations or boosting performance. And those are things that we've seen Polestar and Volvo start doing, and even charging for, and BMW as well. And we've seen Volkswagen doing that in Europe. So you see this level of customization coming. That's not only good for the consumer, right, but it helps in environment in markets like the US, where we sort of have this push-oriented system where, yeah, we have Tesla and people are ordering now direct from manufacturer the majority of the time. Ultimately the industry is deciding how many vehicles should be on the lot. and trying to get that product mix right sometimes can be difficult. That's why we're here. Doing over-the-air updates helps with that tremendously. Being able to, at the point of purchase, helping the buyer decide what actual features they want on their vehicle. So I'm excited to see that and see more proof of, well, not even proof of concept, seeing that in the business world. Over the last few years too, you've seen, when automakers first started coming to CES, it was like, well, they're not electronics company. It was unusual, in the early aughts. Now it's so common that now you're seeing big electronics companies trying to become automakers. And so you saw with Sony, they've been teasing this car for years. And now when they showed the crossover version, I was like, okay, well, they have to be deciding to make these cars because these look production ready. And lo and behold, they teased at the end their one more thing moment that they are creating this subsidiary, Sony Mobility, and maybe looking into making those vehicles. And so that's something exciting too that I've been seeing in the industry. And a lot of that has to do with valuations of consumer electronics companies and automakers alike, and trying to show that they have this future ability to bring all these software side services revenue in. It's much more stable, right, than the cyclical nature of our industry. And really, you need to be in EVs to make that all work.
And I want to go back to something you said a little bit earlier about the personalization and how OEMs, suppliers, and technologies are allowing for that on an ad hoc basis. So, these companies are avoiding spending, the expense to put a certain feature or functionality into all vehicles across the board that some customers may want, some may not, and that also correlates to the sticker pricing and purchase. So allows them to be potentially a little bit more competitive or stay in a certain price range, and then opens up future revenue opportunities, right? So if you want your vehicle to be able to have a different towing capacity or a different configuration in some form or function, they can turn that on and charge you for it. You feel better about the price up front, potentially. You have the people that want it at the time they want it to use something in the way they want to use it, that can be enabled. So I think there's a lot of real benefits to the technology enabling these type of things. And with all of the announcements, Mark, you touched on some of them, Colin, you touched on some of them, so many of those coming out, it just screams the amount of investment and shifted focus that these companies, whether they're, the traditional OEMs, the suppliers, or some of these new entrants, are spending to transition their business into things that frankly they weren't doing, 5 or 10 years ago, potentially 2 or 3 years ago. And so, Mark, I guess that leads me to how should be the OEMs be thinking about this and prioritizing and frankly financing these innovations and investments for tomorrow and next year and 5 years from now, while they're all still having to run their businesses today and build the types of vehicles that we're all buying today. And that shift, how do they prioritize, balance, finance that, and what should they be thinking about?
Kristen, we're helping our customers with that all the time, as you know. It's from the small suppliers to startups to the big OEMs. There's a constant question about how does this impact my business, and what are the next steps that we need to take. And you could see the commercialization of some of this on display, either virtually or in person at CES this year. Let's think about BrightDrop, celebrating its 1-year birthday just yesterday, and it has come to market in a year, right? That was the fastest vehicle production scale that cycle that the GM's ever put into place, and they've already made some deliveries, and they've got these orders from FedEx and from Walmart, and Walmart's talking about how they're going to have 30 million households accessible to home delivery in the next couple of years. And FedEx is going to be shipping over 100 million packages per day by the end of 2023. Okay, and it's like these are kind of obvious transition points for some of these vendors, some of these customers of the companies, and the automakers are saying, well, that's how we have to get into this, and they recognize that the investment up front to build out electrification is going to take a lot of different paths, right? If we're talking passenger vehicle, then it's about driving revenues through these kind of services and OTAs that we were just talking about with Colin. If we're talking about commercial, it's about designing a vehicle that fits the needs, purpose built, fits the needs for the recipient, whether it's ride sharing and ride hailing, and the fact that OEMs are working directly with those service providers to build a car that fits that need, or if it's logistics and last mile delivery. And so at CES we saw lots of this kind of I would say OEM design partnership with their customers, especially on the commercial side, that we haven't really seen before. And that's an important way that they can churn out the new product, make the innovations, while at the same time finding a faster path to ROI. Because for obvious reasons, for the investors, that's the angle they need to go for in order to find the best investment capabilities. And a lot of times it comes down to finding the customer, working with them to get the kind of investment that they're looking for the production. That makes sense.
Right. Absolutely. And and I think this plays into the type of announcements that you saw and where they focused, where each of the major players focused on what they were sharing, right? So Colin, when you look across the OEM strategies or even other, again, large players in the space, what do you see as maybe similarities or differences in what they presented and why?
Sure, yeah. Going back to that valuation concept, there was a lot of announcements again around either EVs or becoming a software and services company, right? So going back to what Mark was saying with Stellantis, they announced a deeper integration with Amazon. So they're going to be bringing Amazon Alexa, a deeper integration with Alexa. They're going to start using the AWS cloud and do more software development capacity with Amazon. What's important there, and I think what investors are looking for too, as well, is just the general upskilling. Does somebody like Stellantis or another major OEM have the proper people in place to do software development? And that has been a challenge for some big players in the industry that have made those pivots over the past few years. And that has to do with the total talent pool. It has to do with having the proper leadership in place and the proper partnerships. So we saw a lot of talk on partnerships, but also about upskilling, also from Stellantis. So that's an angle that is important as well. And then from the EV standpoint, right, we saw close to, I would say, in the double digits in terms of major EV announcements. Of course, we saw the Silverado. We saw multiple different teasers from GM. We saw the revitalization of the Chrysler brand. So EVs can bring that opportunity too, of that lower barrier to entry, or the new sort of platforms that we're using to bring much needed investment to smaller brands like that, like what we see with Chrysler. But it also it allows for fast turnarounds too. So we saw with the Mercedes EQ XX, they mentioned a lot, along with the main purpose of the concept or the conceptualization, that we need to start focusing on efficiency in EVs. They also continued to mention that this was the fastest product that they've ever turned around. They did it, I believe, in 18 months. So that's another benefit that is often being touted by automakers as well, is that long tail of usually 2 to 4 years to bring a vehicle out, in comparison to doing automotive, to doing software development, is another challenge as well.
Yeah, and I'll just add on to that a little bit. When we think about how this industry is pivoting, it's deep into the technical side, and I can't stress that enough. one thing that I found really interesting is in years past, CES has been an area where the tier one suppliers have really shined. They've really brought out their best and brightest technologies and platforms, and they've talked about software. They've talked about the capabilities that they can bring to the market. And this year, while there were tier one announcements, and I'm not going to underscore some of them, but I saw a lot more interesting announcements coming from the silicon vendors, right? We had both Qualcomm and Intel talking about 4 and 5 nanometer process chipsets that are going to drive everything from a digital chassis with the Qualcomm Snapdragon digital chassis to the Mobileye innovations with iQ and their new iQ Ultra platform. This is it's the new horsepower, right? And people really need to recognize that most of what is going to happen in terms of these innovations in automation, in electrification, in highly personalized experiences in the cabin with tons and tons of pixels in front of your eyeballs, it's going to be built off these incredibly high powered compute platforms. And the silicon vendors are acting much more like tier ones than ever before. And they have these relationships with the OEMs directly. So it's not like it's a newfound supply chain design, but just the fact that they're talking about how their products are going to fundamentally, make that leap towards level 3 or level 4 automation and autonomy. That's kind of the game changer. And you saw a little bit of this materialized with what Stellantis has been talking about in the past couple of months. They've been talking about their new 4 vehicle platform and 3 technology platform design, where they're going to have the STLA brain, which is their completely upgradable over-the-air domain centralized electrical architecture. There are going to be 30 ECUs that you can update by 2024. I mean, that's really fast. That's 2 years from right now. And to think about how this company is coming out from their acquisition, their merger, just to see how fast this is starting to move. They're moving at the pace of the semiconductor industry, at the pace of the technology industry, and that pace of play is partially, like I said, driven by the technicals from the semiconductor vendors, but also starting to be driven by the OEMs themselves, by the trends in the industry outside of automotive. So I think that we'd be remiss if we don't talk about how the silicon vendors are driving a lot of this innovation now more so than ever.
Yeah, and just quickly to chime in on what you were talking about, going back to that Mercedes EQXX for a moment, that emphasis and trying to change the conversation now about how efficient is your electric vehicle. Right now,
yes,
most consumers, right, are just thinking, hey, this 8,000 pound, it might be even more, Hummer is zero emissions, and while great, and actually that gets pretty good MPGE. We're going to start moving over to that conversation, particularly as some countries that are more aggressive with regulation and compliance probably bring in those factors. But to that point about the chips, chips and bringing in these new, more advanced ADAS systems, or bringing in these over-the-air or real-time analytics systems, other things like that, requires a significantly higher footprint from a performance standpoint and from a power standpoint. We often don't think about it, maybe you do with your cell phone, but these computers take a tremendous amount of power, and so do these huge displays. So we saw some OEMs emphasize on their displays and other aspects that they've really brought down the power consumption. That's been a big conversation in the chip industry over the past few years, is focusing more on that. And just to give an example, the GM Cruise vehicles with the total AV system in San Francisco, they consume about 3 kilowatt hours per hour of operation. So a normal car battery today, about 60 kilowatt car battery, within a full day of a cruise operation, just the AV systems can consume the whole battery. So in a more traditional vehicle, these more advanced ADAS systems are consuming about 10 to 15% of the power. It's a little different, right? Because it's based on the hour. It's always working, right? It's not, it doesn't matter if you're idle. And so to those points about those chip makers, also NVIDIA talked a little bit more about that performance aspect. And just what was interesting too is, you know, this wasn't a conversation about autonomous cars this year at CES, but there was a conversation about how would that, as we get closer to commercialization, how would that look to the driver? So GM talked about the Ultra Cruise HUD display that they're going to have for their L3 systems in the future for Ultra Cruise. And NVIDIA brought out a new processor, silver box ECU, that would be called the concierge system that would complement their ADAS system. And the point of it is to sort of anthropomorphize the VPA to give it a mascot, a figure potentially, which we've seen is very popular in East Asia primarily. So that's also a concept as we bring autonomous vehicles to the market and electric vehicles, is how are we going to reduce the consumption of electric power from these components as well.
So that was actually, I think, a really good segue, Mark and Colin, the comments you guys just made, talking more about the enabling technology, right? The silicon supply, the capabilities, the resources needed to bring these things to fruition. So I'm gonna hit you with the final question here. Prediction time. What is going to come to fruition soonest and think we'll see on the road or in our garages, or what we'll maybe never see or not for 5 or 10 years? So Mark, I'll ask you first. What do you think we're going to see soonest, or what do you think we'll never see? And then Colin, your prediction as well.
Yeah, I'll try and keep this brief, but I think the thing that we will see pretty soon is a lot more consolidation of the hardware and the electronic systems. And will the consumer see that per se? They won't know it's happening, but what they'll experience is a more integrated type of system, and they're gonna get more and more vehicle experience via OTA, right? And via a platform that drives innovation over time. The vehicle that you buy on day one is not the vehicle that you're going to have after 4 or 5 years. It's going to be evolving. And I think I said this on a Fuel for Thought in the past. Like, the thing I'm most looking forward to is software is being able to buy 4 or 5 different types of cars in one, right? A car that I can take my family to soccer practice in, but then on the weekend I can enjoy it as a sports sedan, or take it on a long road trip and boost its efficiency. These are 4 or 5 different types of cars at times, and being able to have that flexibility in the single product is something that increasingly consumers will be made aware of through this evolution of the electronics and the architecture. There was one other thing that, you can't talk about CES 2022 without saying the word metaverse. It's almost tongue in cheek. It's a new cutting edge trend on the, kind of starting to get hype in the industry. But one thing I will say is Hyundai talked a lot about how they're bringing their robotics acquisition into the marketplace, and really using the technologies with Boston Dynamics to try and create a meta mobility for the point in time when we're all experiencing our daily lives in some version of digital experience. Hyundai wants to be there to provide the metaverse participants per se with a mobility solution. And I think that that's something that they're not going to see, the consumers are not going to see in the next couple of years. But the advancements in consumer electronics side, AR, VR, augmented reality technologies, and the way applications are mapping to this, as well as 5G connections, we're going to start to see that more and more. Sooner or later, it'll end up kind of associated with our cars as well.
So I think what you said, Mark, was you wanted your car to have a split personality, which I thought was a pretty
That's
good
right. That's right. I want my car to have a split personality. Because I only have a 2-car garage, right? I can't afford to have 6 or 7 different types of cars, but if I could do that with one vehicle, I mean, that's going to be possible.
Very good. All right, Colin. Well, how about
Yeah.
you?
I think over the next few years, from a business aspect, we're going to continue to see an increased diversification. I feel like for the last couple of decades, the adage has been stay in your lane, right? And we've seen automakers sort of divest in everything, right? They used to be in military, they used to be in rockets, they used to be in satellites. I think lasers, other things. I think they're going to start diversifying again. And GM brought that up with the Ultium platform, right? That they're working with Hydrotech and Pure Watercraft to bring that system to the power sports industry, to rail transit, using that on fuel cells for rail transit. I think you're going to see OEMs and suppliers talk more about that, about now reintroducing themselves back into other industries now that it makes sense. Conversely, I think you're going to see more electronics companies, major home brands, major brands that are in your pockets doing something perhaps similar to Sony. I think they're going to perhaps look at, is it successful for Sony? Do they get the evaluation? Do they get the media attention? Does it turn into a quagmire? Does it not? I think more consumer electronics companies are going to maybe come online with that, or maybe even totally different brands than we were not expecting at all. Something I think when you're saying from the hype cycle, I feel like potentially the metaverse, I don't know where we are with that, right? Because we had Second Life, if you remember that, like a decade, if you watched The Office or anything and you've seen it, that existed, and that was very much like the metaverse a decade ago. And so maybe this is the ultimate fruition, and we sort of realized where it belongs, or this is just we're sort of in the middle of the road still. I don't know where that is. One thing I definitely expect us not to hear as much from anymore is the eVTOLs. That was very popular last year. Those are the electric-based vertical takeoff vehicles, and a lot of OEMs actually showed those products last year and the year before, and you haven't heard a lot of conversation about that. So I don't know where that's going yet. Electrification and flight in general is very difficult right now from a power perspective, and how much energy we can put in energy storage. But if that were to take off, pun intended, that is something else where OEMs all of a sudden, could be in air, besides Honda today, could be in planes too. Who knows?
Yeah, yeah. That's a whole other podcast, Colin. So with that, we're going to end it there. And I want to thank you, Mark and Colin, for joining me today. We'll be back with more Fuel for Thought next month. To opt into our newsletter that provides more information on this topic and others, visit ihsmarket.com/auto newsletter.